for coming along today, guys. This is a bit of a sample of a program that we've been developing for some time, actually. Probably sort of 2 years ago, maybe could have actually been longer, because those COVID years aren't real years, are they? They're kind of like limbo years. So it's probably more like 4 years ago, if you don't count the COVID years. We developed a face-to-face program, and we've been slowly converting that into an online program. We've also been making some refinements and updates to that program along the way. So this is actually a sample of that program. Really what we've coined this one as design basics, or design psychology. All right, so I'll tell you a little bit about who we are first, and then we'll get cracking on the webinar. Patrick, Sharika, and myself from Opposite, we're a consultancy, a management consultancy, who basically apply human-centered design solutions to office environments, physical infrastructure environments, corporate environments. So we've basically, most of us have a psychological background. We've got some digital graphic designers as well, got some human factor specialists, and I'll show you the team shortly. Just to give you a bit of an idea of what we do, rather than sort of talk about broadly what we do, I just thought I'd throw up a few examples. So you can probably see here, this is an area of our business called simplification. So we do a lot of work in applying human-centered design to simplify processes and systems, procedures and policies and so on. So we've done that quite a bit with many clients. This was a recent piece of work where we took over 170 documents and converted it into something that it was kind of more user-centered, more logical, more usable for people working out in the field. Another sort of area of work we work in is in capability development. So we develop programs, customized programs that usually utilize a bit of gaming in the design, so a bit of playfulness, interactive activities that kind of engage users. So there's a bit of that in this webinar today as well. So we've designed a couple of games as we sort of introduce some of these concepts and materials. So you'll get a bit of a sample of the kind of work that we do there. We also work in infrastructure design, so physical environment, really. This is just one example of one we did recently, where we developed some concept designs for what it might look like if we improved the navigation at the current underground stations here in Melbourne. So using our digital design team and human factors specialists. So these are kind of some mock-ups. So we're really interested in looking at how we can redesign or optimize the physical environment to optimize human performance. So they're just a few examples. This is the team here. We've got people from all walks of life, but most of us have an organizational psychology background. We've all kind of headed into different specialities. And generally speaking, we tend to work in those areas I've just introduced there. So you see a fairly broad team there, very different levels of skills and experience. But what kind of unites us is that we're all human-centered designers. So we in any area of work that we're looking at, we're always thinking about who's the person going to be using the tool, who's the person going to be using the environment, and how can we make it a lot easier for them. If you are interested, if you haven't already, we've got a website, strangely enough. That's the web address. There's also a QR code. Apologies if that gives anyone PTSD from the check-ins at restaurants. Obviously, yeah, you can just jump on the website at any time. So let's jump into the actual webinar topic. So this this sample really comes from a module that we developed a while back, and it's been enhanced. So there might be a few people who possibly dialed in today who may have actually attended this in the past. So it has been updated since then. But it was kind of one of the first activities we developed in the program, and it was around taking us right back to looking at what makes us truly human, which is the interaction of human and tools. And the rest of the program, which we've also developed into an online program, covers lots of other topics as well. So it looks at things like human error, human experience, systems thinking, behavioral nudging. So the full program basically covers all these different topics. This is only really a truncated sample of module 2. We do have the full program that will be that's available on Eventbrite. It starts in September. We've designed it so that it intentionally designed not to be like what we had before, which was a 2-day program, because what we're finding more and more is that people are wanting a lot more flexibility. So we've designed it over 8 weeks into smaller mini modules that happen on a Friday morning. So it's one of those things that if you don't have, it's not a huge time commitment each week. It's a couple of hours and an opportunity to engage more closely with the material and the other topics that I just briefly mentioned a short while ago. We also have, and we'll introduce a few of these cards today, actually, electronic digital versions of them. We've basically developed a big set of cards which establishes a lot of our psychological expertise and human-centered design expertise into a card set. So it's like, I think it's about well over 200 cards that summarize all different aspects of job design. So it could be tool design, it could be workplace design, systems thinking, and so on. So some of those cards you'll see a little bit later, you get take a closer look at them. So this is the topic focus for today. We're going to go at the start. I'm going to spend a little bit of time just going through a bit of the topic area itself. So we're going to be looking at the psychology of design. So what do we actually mean when we talk about psychology and design? Then more practically, what is human-centered design? For those of you who are interested in more of an introduction into human-centered design, what exactly do we mean when we talk about human-centered design? We'll then talk a little bit about anthropometrics and heuristics, so design heuristics. So there'll be a bit of a mix of both physical and cognitive design characteristics that are important when you're thinking about designing things for a human being. And then we'll also be looking at different contexts. So we've come up with one context today, which is looking at the video game industry, but then we'll look at some other contexts as well, because design obviously is relevant to all sorts of industries. Throughout the session today, feel free to pop questions in the chat. We'll do our very best to answer them online. So Patrick and Sharika will jump in if they can during the session. If the question is more complicated, we'll try and answer them at the end or follow up with you a bit later if you wanted to leave your details. So this is a fairly short version, so we're going to be zipping through fairly speedily. All right, let's talk about the psychology of design. What actually makes a good design? So this is an example from a movie. I don't know if anyone notices or can actually figure out what this is from, but a movie that I used to take for granted that everyone had seen. But now that I've gotten a little bit older, I've noticed that quite a few younger people haven't actually seen this movie, because it came out in the 1960s, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and there's an early scene in it that you might be familiar with. Even if you haven't seen the film, you may have seen it through pop cultural references, where basically our human ancestors, which look like apes, are fighting over like a water supply, or like an area with fresh water. And through alien intervention in this movie, they imply that evolution was sparked through alien intervention. One of the apes discovers that they can actually use that bone there to club the other one over the head several times. And ultimately it means that his tribe of apes can take over the water supply, and they become the dominant force in that area. The whole point of that early scene is really to show kind of that first spark of evolution, which eventually branches off into a science fiction story set in space. But I always, when I was reflecting on developing this program, I was trying to think of an early tool that people used to use, and one of those things definitely was bones. And you think about it, you can look at that as a bone, or you could think of it as a tool. And it's a fantastic tool in many ways, because it's a really good weight. It's a good shape to hold as well. It's smooth, easy to hold. It's got enough density to be used as a weapon. And you can also think of it as there's a ready supply, a sustainable supply of weapons always on hand, because there will always be dead animals leaving bones lying around. So early humans would have been using bones all the time. They've been really practical, handy tools to have around. As we've become more advanced, though, we've also can start to think of tools like this. We could, this particular bone wasn't just a weapon, it actually enabled an opportunity for a group of these apes. They enabled an opportunity to find fresh water. It also promoted their own survival, promoted the survival of their kin, so they were able to perhaps pass on their genes to maybe to us, potentially. Also, the tool provides security as well. So in short, ultimately what these devices actually allow us to do is that they're functional. So they actually allow us, so the design of them actually allowing us to achieve something. And that's something that seems to be quite fundamental to design. Something isn't designed just because it was designed. It was designed because, or it's designed well because it actually serves a particular functional purpose. Now let's talk a little bit more about psychology. Just out of interest, and it's probably maybe just pop into the chat. Can anyone spot what I'm actually showing you here? Some people see it immediately. Other people they've got no idea. I spot it immediately, but partly because so. Okay. What have we got there? Sharika, what are some of the answers we've got there?
So we've got tiger. Tiger seems to be the most common answer. There's also leopard, 2 people, hyena.
Okay, 2 people. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah.
Yes, well, I was, yeah, definitely it was a tiger. Fascinating though in a way, because in many ways, if you look at this, that is fantastic camouflage. But even with that camouflage, we can quite easily see it. But even when you obscure it right down to being extremely blurry, you can spot something there, can't you? And when you think about that, we take that for granted as well, that this is actually one of our most amazing attributes, which is basically being able to take things like this, looking at basically shapes or parts. But when they form a picture, we can look at it and go, right, there's actually something here. Interestingly, of course, though, there is actually nothing here. This is not actually a truck. I'm sure you can all see the truck there. It's just shapes still, but they're put together in such a way that actually make us see the whole part. So we're fantastic at pattern recognition. This is an example of, I think it's in India, but there was a few almost near accidents because drivers were perceiving that image on the left as like a chasm, and so would suddenly sort of swerve away from it. It's actually a puddle of water. So we're fantastic at recognizing patterns even when those patterns are not there. So it's in our interest to do so, because it's much better to spot something that could potentially kill us than make mistakes like that. It doesn't hurt us too much if we make an error of judgment like that. We're still around to see it, but it'd be much more catastrophic if there was in fact a chasm there and we didn't take action. Now, has anyone, I'm not sure, this one actually did the rounds on social media a while back. And for those of you, well, those of you looking at it now, what can you see here? What object can you identify? And maybe just pop it in the chat again. And Sharika, you might like to, because I have a bit of difficulty when I'm sharing my screen to see the chat.
I think everyone's thinking.
Everyone's thinking, are they?
Yeah. Oh, we've got some. We've got jewelry, monkey, bear.
Jewelry, monkey, bear.
Food.
Yeah, I must admit, I feel like I can see jewelry there. Although this image, my understanding of this image is intentionally being designed so that you feel as though you can see something, but the closer you look at it, the more you realize, I don't really think that I'm seeing anything at all. It's been designed to basically almost not have a pattern, not quite have a pattern enough for you to recognize anything. Here's some examples of people on Twitter responding to that horrible image. I'm not sure if it's just me, and I've shown this for quite a few people now. It's a very unnerving image. And I think that one of the reasons why is because it's actually one of the best examples that I've ever seen that simulates where pattern recognition fails, because we're so good at seeing patterns, and unless you've had a traumatic brain injury or something seriously wrong, we can't help but see patterns. And when we look at something and there's just nothing there, it's unnerving because it's an ambiguous situation and we're not left with any sort of sense of closure at all. And so, yeah, certainly every time I look at that image, it gives me terrible sort of angst and anxiety. And I like scrolling through the Twitter comments because everyone seems to be completely distressed by that image. There's other aspects of pattern recognition that are also important as well. I mean, there's so many ways that we identify patterns. It's not just visually. We do it through all of our senses, and we seem to be hardwired to do that. And we also learn through the social world, but certainly we know that infants can recognize their names at a very young age. So they learn to detect that pattern in language very quickly because it's a meaningful pattern. We're hardwired to identify food as well. I don't know if I just recently got a puppy, and I've certainly noticed that the puppy will spot anything that might potentially be food, even when it isn't. They just zoom right in on it. Our eyes, depending on what kind of animal we are, our eyes have evolved to detect patterns in different contexts. So interestingly, if you're an animal that's lower to the ground, your pupils dilate horizontally, so because you see like a panorama. But if you're taller and you're not prey, you're actually a predator, then your pupils dilate the other way, typically. We're also very good at reading faces. It varies in accuracy depending on the emotion, but generally it's pretty high. Like even very subtle emotions, we can look at faces and go and detect, yeah, this is somebody who looks like they might be aggressive, or this is somebody who likes me, all of those things. And we're also fantastic at identifying patterns where they don't exist, hence all the, conspiracy theories, all the things we potentially worry about that never actually come true. We see patterns, worries and threats everywhere. So when you think about when we're designing something for that sort of psychology, you've got to think about that everything that we've got in front of us is a potential pattern that our brain is almost automatically detecting. And when things don't work, it just doesn't feel right. It feels wrong immediately. So we're going to be moving into an activity shortly, but before we do that, I'll give you a brief background, very brief, into human-centered design. We're going to talk a little bit about chocolate for a minute. So if I bring up a Kit Kat, how would you normally eat a Kit Kat? Well, most people, I would say, I was going to say 90% of people eat it the way on the left, and just as a bit of a joke, but I don't think you'd actually believe that. And then it occurred to me that what's on your left may not be on my left as well, so you might get a bit confused. But yeah, but obviously when you look at something, even something as simple and innocuous as a chocolate bar, like a Kit Kat, it's designed in a particular way to drive you to eat it in a particular way. So the way it's organized, the chocolate, and the way it breaks off, the way it makes a satisfying sound when you click it, it's almost intuitive to eat a Kit Kat that way. No one has to actually instruct you to eat it that way. Another chocolate example I thought was quite funny is this one, which is, if anyone ever has Toblerone, apparently the way you eat a Toblerone is like this. You actually click it off. You almost push it against the other chocolate to eat it. I've never eaten it that way. I've always done it the other way. That looks like a really interesting and effective way of actually doing that. You might go, well, that's a great design. Or you might actually say the opposite. You might say, well, if nobody is actually using it the way it was actually designed, then maybe it's a bad design. Or it could be an analogy for training, that there are great designs out there only if you know how to use them. There's plenty of things out there that are much more effective once you've actually learned how to actually use them. And then, of course, there are other situations where individuals almost defy the design intent. And here's a few examples here. At least the first two are, I guess, human designed things. The last one, it was almost against nature. or perhaps where, for those of you who don't eat onions like that, perhaps we're the odd ones, maybe it is perfectly reasonable to actually pick an onion and eat it like that, and maybe society sort of moved away from what was once a fairly simple thing to do. Okay, so let's now talk about a bit about design, and I'll sort of link that up with what we've been discussing so far. All right, so I just looked up a simple definition of design, because we use that term all the time and in so many different contexts. So we talk about design in fashion, we talk about design in construction, we talk about design even in like graphic design, or in procedure design, or in the design of training. So the term is used all the time. And this is basically a definition of that: to create, fashion, execute, or construct according to plan. Not very nice and broad definition. Here's an example of something I came across, which I thought was quite funny. This was a kitchen where the structure of the building, I'm not sure why it came about this way. It may have been because it was retrospectively built, or perhaps just badly planned. But there's a big structural beam going right through the kitchen there. I don't know how you guys feel about this, but that'd be a complete nightmare for me. I was actually showing this to my daughter last night out of interest, and she said, I wouldn't buy that place. And I think this would definitely be a deal breaker. And I thought perhaps this was actually just a made up image. But I actually looked up the address, and it's online. And I scrolled through the photos in the real estate section, and it looks like a fantastic apartment, and they actually have one at the kitchen, but they've got a photo turned around the other way. But you can see the beam sort of slightly in the corner, right in the corner, if you know it's there. You can imagine how disappointed you'd be if you'd found this wonderful place you'd seen online, and then the first thing you do when you walk through the door, you see a big beam coming through the kitchen. I'm sure they've had many people who've just walked away. So when we think about design, so design, it's all well and good to say, oh, look, it's about really good planning. But when we look at human-centered design, let's take it through its typical journey. And this can be applied in any sort of industry or context. The origin of design is in our brains. So psychology is really important, because everything that we see around us that was built or developed at some point was in someone's imagination. And what we're really good at doing as human beings is transforming thought into abstraction. So the abstraction could be simple as a simple sketch, or verbalized to another person and described. So we can take this sort of fantasy that we've got in our heads and turn it almost into another fantasy in a way, but it's slowly getting closer to something. And then ordinarily with design, it ultimately ends up in some sort of material form. It could be electronic, it could be physical, but it's materials that, were once just, again, a fantasy in someone's head, and now materialized in front of us. And then ultimately what we're trying to do with everything is we're designing it for other people. We may not even realize that. Sometimes we feel so far removed from the customer, but ultimately, everything that we do is in service of our society, of others. Even if in fact it might be for yourself in some cases. You might be designing something because you take great pleasure from it. You might just paint because you enjoy painting and you enjoy looking at your own work. You don't necessarily doing it because you want to sell the painting, but it's ultimately for human experience. And this is where all of this comes together in terms of experience design, the psychology, which is throughout the entire process, the design process, which is obviously throughout the entire process. All of these things are absolutely critical. And then in terms of where the human fits in, well, the human fits in all the way through, because the human's the one who's dreaming up the solution, but they're also imagining what the other human wants to use. And then in a formal setting, human-centered design is a much more dedicated focus to actually paying attention to that. So saying, we know that this person's going to be using it, this user's going to be doing it. So let's actually sit down with them and really understand what they need. Let's test the ideas with them. Let's be more self-aware of our own inherent biases and our own psychology, because we may design something that we think is fantastic because it just appeals to our own our own interests, not necessarily what's going to be useful for other people. Putting it another way, and this you might have seen wheels like this before in human-centered design. It literally is putting the human at the center of everything. So it's saying that when we think about a human being, we have to think about the environment that they're in, the processes and systems around them, the social, cultural environment around them, their own individual needs as well. So it's very much human-centered design is basically saying all of those things are having an influence on that individual. So if you're designing something for the human, you really have to you do have to think about all the different inputs and things that are nudging them in order for them to actually to change, if that's what you're looking to do. So you may design a fantastic tool, but if it completely impractical in their physical environment, then they won't use it. Really good example is in construction. If you print out complicated procedures or forms that have a lot of glare when you take them out as well, because they're printed on white paper, then people won't use them because you're working in a physical environment where it's not useful. And there's many instances where we do consulting work in organizations where one of the trickiest things is when coming up, clients may come up with a really good idea, a really good training program, really good tool, but the actual environment that they're working in itself kind of suppresses the effectiveness of that tool. So just in summary, before we move on and into the next section, which we'll get into a bit of an activity, is when we think about what's really important for understanding human beings, we're pattern recognizers. So one of the things that we're primed to do when we consider the design of things or the psychology of design is that things that break the pattern stand out. That could be for good, might be for benefit. So a stop sign breaks the pattern on the road because it does stand out, it's red, it gets your attention. But then there are other instances of where the pattern breaks, where we go, well, that's not right at all. That beam that's going through the kitchen, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't look functional. There are particular stimuli that we design that can actually prime what we expect to happen. So pick up that Kit Kat, we know, what do we expect when we actually click the chocolate off? We expect it to break off. We don't expect the whole thing to crumble in our hands, for example. That ultimately, when we've got an ambiguous situation, so when something is designed in a way that isn't logical, which doesn't have any order to it, it can be unnerving and unsettling. So that could be as simple as when you design, say, it could be like a train station, where you think about the security of that train station, all the things that have to come together to make a person feel safe and secure. Order often brings that comfort and security. When we don't have it, then we might reject the design. And then ultimately, when we think about design, it's there to create meaning, and it's there to create meaningful environments and tools. So we apply human-centered design in order to make sure that the end product and systems and processes, or whatever we might be designing, are meaningful to that user. That's the whole intent of it. So now we're going to go into the next section now, and we're actually going to briefly play a few games which introduce us to some of the some more practical design principles that can be used. So there are lots of different industries that as I mentioned before, I mean, so many different industries that use design or where design is critical. And this is probably not even an exhaustive list. These are just really me cherry picking a few industries where it's quite critical. But let's face it, every industry has some sort of design in it that's important. Here are some examples. The one we wanted to focus on today was an industry that's actually quite, I think, quite effective at designing things for humans, and that's the video game industry. And just to give a bit of an example, you think about like the actual design system of a game. I think there's a lot to learn from it, and a lot of organizations have, certainly over the last 10 years or so, were attempting to really apply some of the great lessons learned from video games by applying a concept was called gamification. And it was really looking at sort of game, the game dynamics and applying them to different workplaces. So it might be trying to solve a problem, develop a game around the problem, and you might be more likely to solve it, and so on. But there's actually so much more to games than just providing tokens and rewards and things like that. Certainly, that's an aspect of it. If you look at games, they're very good at giving you instant gratification. Usually in workplaces, we don't get that. We don't get immediate reward with things, maybe because some of the things that we work on take a little bit longer. But certainly if you play it out in an organizational context, reward and feedback can be as simple as your boss saying, "That's great work, fantastic." But games do it really well because almost everything you do on a game, every button you press, every movement you make, there's usually some sort of reaction. So that's one of the reasons they're quite addictive. There's also a fantastic way that they've designed a game to allow you to develop and learn. So they usually create a system where you learn very slowly what you can and can't do. They put you in a safe environment, and then as you're getting better and better, they put you in more challenging situations. And that really does sound like how we'd like to learn in most workplaces, is almost like just slowly get used to things and keep working at your level that makes you challenged, but also makes you feel competent. Games are really good at doing that and really getting that formula right so people keep playing. It's not too challenging that I give up, but challenging enough that I'm interested. And there are other factors in games as well that are quite important. There's the element of surprise. The game doesn't just always follow a normal structure. Occasionally there's some little unique surprises that pop out of nowhere. The interfaces and the design of games, which we're going to talk about in much more detail shortly, are designed to be very simple and intuitive, very simple dashboards, very simple metrics that pop up so that you're not confused. So that, think about how complex a lot of our workplaces are and how we measure performance and how we report on performance. And you usually get this sea of traffic light colors and things, depending on what industry you're in. There's a sense of novelty in games, and I mentioned challenge just a bit earlier. And then there's one other thing that's quite interesting about games, and going back to my point earlier about the 2001: A Space Odyssey, the apes, is that they're very social as well. Even though you can see people sitting there almost looking like they're playing by themselves, over time they've definitely become much more social. And now we've got big networks of games. I've got 3 little girls who hop on their iPads, but they're quite often they're playing games or interacting with people online, even though they appear to be sitting by themselves. So no doubt learning a really advanced form of online interactions that many of us perhaps have picked up certainly by working over the years, but will not be as skilled as they will be in, say, 10 years when they have to go do working from home or anything like that. It'll just be second nature. Right, so what I'm going to do now is we're going to pop a link in the chat. So Sharika is going to pop a link in. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to go to what's called a Miro board. Now, ideally, if you've got Google Chrome, launch it in Google Chrome. You don't have to actually participate. We're not going to be talking or anything like that. It's purely going to be interacting with the board. If you just wanted to sit back with a cup of coffee and watch the webinar, then feel free to do so. You can still do that. But for those of you who are interested in sort of jumping on and interacting with the board for a little bit and learning a bit more about these online boards if you haven't before, then just click on that link. When you clicked on the link, I'll join you in a second and introduce you to Patrick, who will run the activity. So I'll stop my presentation now and I'll share my screen so everyone else can see what we're doing.
As Nick's going about doing that, guys, I'll just mention, I'll highlight, by the way, my name's Patrick. I'm a psychologist and consultant with Opposite. Just as you may be joining on the Miro board, as Nick mentioned, there's no requirement to do so. You're perfectly able to engage the activities through the Zoom webinar interface. And Nick is going to share his screen so you see what is happening on the Miro board as well. Equally, the intention here is not to frustrate or anything like that. So if you find yourself or find the Miro interface just getting in the way of your enjoyment of the webinar, feel free just to drop it and engage through Zoom, so you're able to relax and enjoy your Friday morning. Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. So you'll probably see here, guys, we've landed on a board which is intentionally paying homage to Nintendo, and then you'll see little character there. It's not Mario. That's an N, not an M. That's supposed to be me. That was Andres, our graphic designer, having a bit of fun. There'll be another character coming up later. I think that's based on Patrick. So if we just, if you'd like to, you can probably see all the, for those of you watching, or those of you who are on the board, you can probably see a lot of cursors zipping around. And that's basically all your peers here at the webinar today. So if you'd like to, you all probably can see there is a link, and some of you have already exploring and have clicked on the link, which is fine. Feel free to do so. We'll go to the first activity. And if you're having any trouble for any reason, for whatever it might be, clicking on that link, then Sharika will put the second link in the chat. That's just as a little bit of a backup. So some of you have found it. So just explore the board. For those of you, yeah, a few of you still, yeah, you probably see the link. It's just in the hollow of that tree. What's down that tree? That's it. Everyone's getting the hang of it now. What I might, yeah, all right. And I might just pop onto the second board now. Okay. So it probably, yeah, that worked well. So we've got quite a number of you there. You've jumped along, and I'll just hand over to Patrick now to talk through the activity.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. If you can please zoom in, Nick, so we're able to see, yeah, for those who have not joined the Miro board, they're able to see what's going on, because they can just see a huge number of names around the place. So guys, here it was mentioned in the chat earlier by Samantha that video game controls, or console controllers, and indeed computer controllers, provided a really good example of evolution in design. Becoming increasingly sophisticated or increasingly conscious of the way, of the psychological and physiological needs of users and how they interact. So the activity here, some people have already read the instructions and got started. For those who are slightly more patient and awaiting instructions, I'll just reveal those to you now. So essentially, what we'd like you to do here is review the controllers across the years that they are presented. So you can see going all the way back to the 6th century, all the way through to 2013 being the most recent example of various types of video game interface, or indeed just game interface, where we get back to the 9th and 6th century. And your task here is to identify the ones that are misplaced. So they are placed in the wrong year. Some of them are out of order, not all of them are. And you indicate your choices by moving a coin next to those that you believe are incorrect. Now, if you are following along via Zoom, feel free just to insert into the chat the name of those that you believe are incorrect, that are misplaced in terms of the year. And we will incorporate your response. Righto, so feel free to get started, guys. And when you're placing your coins, I would appreciate if you were to just not place it over the top of the image, but place it just below. That'd be great. And we don't mind if there's a bit of a pile below as well. You don't need to order them at all. So let's see. Okay, so we've got a few going for PlayStation, for example. Yeah, excellent. And I'll give you a couple of minutes, or a minute or so, to do this. And one thing you'll note, and I suppose something to keep in mind, is whether you feel that practices in relation to design thinking, and in particular human-centered design, were sufficiently advanced to enable the product associated with that year. So indeed, with 1985, was design thinking sufficiently advanced to enable that particular product at that particular time. All right. Okay. Oh, geez, we've got actually quite a bit of diversity in responses here.
Yeah, it looks like there's quite a bit of at least PlayStation 2 looks like it's quite a consensus there.
Yeah, indeed. PlayStation 2 in 96.
Yeah, interesting.
Yes, that does seem a little bit early, doesn't it?
It might, Patrick. Yes, it looks like it might be. A lot of people put the Wii. Yeah, 2006 feels a bit late, doesn't it? Almost feels like that happened at the turn of the century. Is that correct?
Yeah, and then Lego in 1932 is another interesting one. I wonder whether extruded plastic was, sufficiently advanced to be mass produced at that time.
Mhm.
Who knows? You know, Nick.
Nobody wanted to have a punt at the 3DO, and I could understand that because probably most people, even if you played games, probably had no idea what the 3DO was.
Yeah, indeed. Yes, gaming's poor cousin, forgotten cousin. Poor old 3DO.
Of course, there is one thing here. Of course, not that I think anyone would want to cheat, but you could quite easily hop online and find out the answers to all of these things. Unfortunately, this isn't Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, so there's not much at stake to cheat, though.
That's exactly right. I think that people who practice in human-centered design and who are interested in human-centered design are just by nature high-quality individuals with a solid moral compass. So it was never a risk here. So shall we reveal the answer, Nick? Do you want to reveal what's happening with the to the group?
I'll just share my other screen for a sec, guys.
Yeah.
One sec. All right, so the answer, and I actually think we were nudging in that direction, was, here we go here. So, yeah, interestingly, the Wii, a lot of people put that down. That was 2006. And to be honest, I actually double checked that because when I looked at it, I was thinking, that does feel a bit late, but no, it was 2006. The correct answers were, the Nintendo, definitely a PlayStation 2 was in the wrong spot. That happened a little bit later. So basically the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 2, you could flip them around. If we look down the bottom there, the Atari was in the 70s. I think a few people picked up on that one. Atari definitely was in the 70s, not in the 80s. And I think that the other one was the Game Boy was in the wrong spot. I think quite a few of you also picked up on that as well.
Nick, are we supposed to see the answers here, mate? Because we can't see them. We can only see insert coin.
Oh, okay. Apologies. I will, let's see what I'll do here.
Next slide, I think.
How's that? Has that worked?
Nope.
Oh, one sec. I'll just do something else.
There we go. And see it now.
See that? Yeah, because it's the, there we go. We'll just do it like that. Yeah, so there are the answers there, guys. Now, just in the interest of times, interest of time, I should say. No, I think my subconscious was saying we live in interesting times. We will proceed. So I'm going to share my screen again, and just let me know. Maybe Pat, you could let me know if we're having any problems seeing the board I'm about to share. Okay. All right. So let's return back to the board, and if you could, guys, see if you can find the next link. So if you scroll over to the right, and someone has done a fantastic little smiley face made of coins. Thank you, very creative. Yep, holding them, and then you'll probably see that. Yep, we'll be jumping off onto another board now. So those of you who, yeah, that's it. That's the way. And Sharika will pop this is basically going to take us back to the home page. So I'll meet you back over on the home page. Reconnect. It's the thing with these online sessions, that it all hinges on whether the internet connection remains stable. All right, so we're now going to come along over to the right. So let's just navigate over to the right. I think it's interesting watching all these arrows. We've often run workshops where that we might have 10 or 15, but when you get this many arrows, you really do see a pattern. Some people immediately find the next spot. Others sort of wander around a bit more. Others get a little bit lost. So I wonder if those who found the next link are gamers, perhaps. And Sharika's brought us over just for convenience. Thanks, Sharika. So we're going to go to the next activity, and once there, Patrick will jump on. And what we're going to do is basically following on from the last activity, which is kind of like a bit of a warm-up in a way of thinking about the design of things across time, we're now going to think about what are the particular characteristics that emerged across time that we think may have changed. Have things just stayed static with video game controllers, or have they actually changed quite a bit? And in what particular way have they actually changed? So that'll be the next activity. So I'll just move on to the next board. I think I'm in the right spot. Yes, just reconnecting.
Right.
For those of you watching.
Yep. So if you just zoom in, Nick, so you can see the controllers there. So everyone can see the controllers, please. Yeah, beautiful. So we have two collections of controllers here, video game controllers, from two different eras. So on the left, we've got 2000s and onwards. And then on the right, we have 1970s and 1980s. So we can see some distinct differences in the design here, right? How they're constructed, the way in which they expect or demand the user to interact with them. What we'd like to do here is have you consider the extent to which, consider the differences between these two sets of designs, so 2000 and onwards and then 70s and 80s, on a number of different dimensions, which are just to the right. So for both the 2000 and onwards, which is marked there with the yellow coin, and also the 70s and 80s, we want you to rate on these scales the extent to which you think they are clunky or aesthetics is predominant. Whether they need training or have a more intuitive design. I mean, this is something that some, particularly those who might not be familiar with video controllers, might find them intimidating. For example, I know when I first introduced my dad, I think, to a PlayStation 2 controller, he needed a little bit of time to come to grips with it, right? And asked me a number of questions about how to use it. And then below that, we have simplicity. So on the left, to what extent do you feel those two separate groups of designs are complex versus simple? And then if we go further to the right, we have examples of whether the size accounts for physical considerations or not, whether they might be comfortable or uncomfortable for the user. And I can tell you right now that using an Atari 2600 controller for, for an extended period of time does not do wonders for one's hands. And then lastly, whether they accommodate a range of functionality and movement, or are more fixed in their position of interactive elements. And certainly, at least to my mind, this is something that has advanced quite considerably, where different hand sizes and adaptive requirements have been incorporated into the design of these controllers. You've got multiple, you're able to map different buttons to different actions and that sort of thing as well. So they're more customizable to suit the way in which an individual prefers to interact with that item and that object, rather than just demanding that they use the buttons in the way originally intended or with one specific way of operating in mind. So Nick, looks like many people here have contributed their responses. Would you like to summarize what we've got here?
Yeah, look, yeah, very interesting, and actually very not surprising in a way. I wasn't sure if everyone would necessarily agree with what I was thinking, but certainly I think over time the controllers moved from being sort of fairly pedestrian, clunky, and just functional, really, to really considering something to be more beautiful and perhaps something even that you might not feel as uncomfortable at sort of leaving around in your living room. It kind of looks like it blends in. You've seen the consoles over time have changed. Interestingly, I agree with the second one as well. I think that how intuitive the design is perhaps has become less so over time and it might actually contrast with that last one over here, which is the fixed position and full functionality and movement. There's a lot more options available now with controllers over time, reflecting on the fact that they've recognized that humans, when playing games, are actually can be quite sophisticated. They don't just need one button to press and one movement to make. They can actually press lots of different buttons. But as a result of that, I agree with what Pat was saying earlier. And my parents had no hope of ever picking up an original Nintendo controller and would be completely bamboozled, I think, by an Xbox controller or something that's just covered in buttons. They wouldn't even know where to start.
Nick, oh, if I may, I just wanted to attend to a comment made by Dia Day in the chat there. They say that they feel like our interpretation of what we expect with aesthetic or intuitive design would vary considerably with our current experience and may be very subjective. I wonder, in fact, whether those two things could be separated. So one's aesthetic preferences, so how one looks and what one feels like, might be a subjective preference, where intuitivity, if you like, the extent to which the design is intuitive could potentially be more universal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Yeah, definitely. And there's probably overlap with a few of the different categories as well. But certainly, I think, over time, one of probably the red herring, I think, was that Nintendo Wii remote that people probably, even if you didn't play it, would have seen ads for it. They actually went back to something which was supposed to be a bit more universal, and it actually links back to what I was mentioning earlier with the tool that the Ape from 2001 had. Very simple, hold it like a stick, and that was the concept. Let's bring it right back to, you don't have to pick it up like a foreign object. You pick it up like something that you would find in any part of your life, which looks like a stick, and just wave it around. And I thought that was actually a really good example of you being able to use your intuition. And if we scroll over here now, a bit of a mix at the top there, but generally speaking, it looks like there was perhaps a greater recognition of the physical characteristics over time, but I imagine that others might be thinking, well, some of the sizes over time perhaps have become a little bit too large, or maybe not quite the right size as well. And certainly comfort, I think, more and more people are recognizing that people will play games for hours, and having something that's comfortable, that sits in your hands, that doesn't weigh too much, all of those things are really important. This is really just a bit of an intro into some of the design features, which we're going to go into now in a little bit more detail and talk about them in a bit more of a formal way. But in essence, over time, there certainly has been these sort of broad trends. And I think mostly what's happened is things have become more complex. There's been greater freedom afforded to the user. However, that perhaps has come at the expense of needing to have a bit more training and skill in order to use the tools. All right, so what we might do is accelerate through to, if you click on that link, it'll take you back home again. Once you're there, don't worry about it. You can just stay there for now, and I'll relaunch my presentation for the next part, just to introduce us to before we do the next activity. So I'll just stop my share and share my screen again. All right, so Patrick, just tell me if you can see this. Can everyone see that?
See the slides, yep. You're on activity answers.
How about now, if I do that?
Has not changed.
Yeah, okay, so I might just keep it on this, only because it's rather than mess around. Okay, so, all right, so let's talk a little bit about a couple of different topics. Anthropometrics and heuristics. Okay, let's talk about, basically what we've done is, obviously being a bit of an introductory session into human-centered design, any one of these topics could branch off into many examples and methodologies and things. But what we've done is we've summarized a lot of, I guess you'd call them almost like the key information that you want to consider in design into these little cards that we've developed, or categories. And so if we think about like the physical characteristics of things, there's operation, so how something might actually operate. A good example of that might be, a really obvious one is when you flick on a light switch, it operates in a particular way that actually has an expected outcome. It makes a satisfying click sound when you click it on. If you look at light switches, generally they tend to be very much the same. You don't often get them to be, they're not too diverse. And when they are, you can sometimes get a bit confused. You probably found that in some office settings where they've changed the sort of the light switch buttons a bit to fit in with the decor, and you sometimes kind of search, try and find what you're looking for. We also, when it comes to physical design, have to really be pragmatic about lots of things, like how much something weighs. I go back to that example before about the bone, you know, nice, light, easy weight. You can easily pick it up. Obviously, how often you use it is a consideration there. So it might not matter too much if something's a little bit heavy if you pick it up once in a while, but if you're lifting it all day, then you can develop sort of musculoskeletal problems. Interestingly, of course, if you're at a gym, weight's a completely different factor. You actually do want to have things that are quite clunky and heavy, because that's the whole point. The position of things is really important. That obviously plays a part in the game design controllers that we just had then. You know, you don't want to have your buttons located too far away from where your thumbs are going to be, for example, because that would make it kind of awkward to have to actually move your thumbs there. The size, we just discussed size quite a bit already around looking at controller design, but the size of objects has to kind of match for what you're actually doing. So when you get into a motor vehicle, the steering wheel fits a nice simple grip. You don't get into a motor vehicle and find that you can't get your hands around it. It's kind of designed to be a general size for most people to be able to grip quite easily. And then there's texture as well that needs to be considered. So again, steering wheel, I don't know if you've ever driven a car that's a little bit too old and it loses its grip, and it's actually quite a significant risk that needs to be addressed. A key sort of safety feature of the car is being able to actually grip the wheel. So yeah, certainly if we were to go back in time and do a bit of an assessment of the bone, then we would certainly find that it certainly meets quite a few criteria, hence why it's quite a useful tool. I do hope that people don't go away from today thinking, is Nick just trying to tell us that we should be making better use of the bones that are available from the kitchen? Obviously there's Patrick, there's sort of laughing and rolling his eyes at the same time. Which is a very hard skill to master. If we look at something that we mentioned earlier around the kitchen, a horrible kitchen with a massive steel beam, which I can imagine the real estate agent trying to sell it as a feature. Certainly it interferes with operation. It's in a horrible position. That's really the big problem with it. But then, of course, size is a big problem with it as well, because it perhaps wouldn't have been such an issue if it was a really small beam that was kind of located, really like just underneath the shelves or something where you could barely make it out and it didn't get in the way. So obviously position and size become a really big problem there. All right, so now that was talking a little bit about a bit of a crash course in some of the key physical design characteristics. Now, there's also some more cognitive related ones. So the things that we actually see with our eyes are really important. So let's talk about, I guess, how we look at information and the psychology of how we actually go about doing that. Introduced earlier the idea that we look for patterns. We don't just look for patterns just generally. There are specific types of patterns that seem to pop out to us. And how we consider something to be of good design usually means that it's met one of those patterns, or if appropriate, it may not have met the pattern intentionally. So it's designed to actually break the pattern in such a way in order for people to actually notice it. So as a good example was when people put down that sort of yellow and black tape on the ground, that's intentionally designed to break up a pattern somewhere where you might have missed the step, or there might be a bit of a bump in the carpet that you might not have noticed because we're not necessarily picking up on the design of that environment as seamlessly hidden a potential hazard. So we've covered quite a few different heuristics. We've kind of summarized them into a few different categories. I'll talk about them kind of broadly, generally, and then we'll actually go into an activity looking at those controllers again and to see if we can identify the relevant heuristics that might be at play and why a particular, say, controller design might actually be more effective than another one. And so some really basic ones are around maybe some how we actually present the information. So there could be information that is presented in a continuous way. So a good example of continuity, for example, is when I don't know if you've ever seen on the road when they have active lights now, where you see the lights kind of all light up in a sequence and they kind of follow one from the other. That's actually a really good example of expressing a pattern where there actually isn't really anything there. It's not like each light really is talking to each other and telling you something. It's just presented in such a way that makes it look like it's presenting continuity for you. Proximity is another one. That's where you basically try and group functions together. There's also, this is actually an importance heuristics in the wrong spot, but it's basically where you're trying to emphasize or highlight something through contrast. And again, we can explore some of these cards in a little bit more detail in the activity. We also have some heuristics that are designed basically to be to afford the user some freedom. Some really good examples of freedom heuristics, or we've dubbed them freedom heuristics, are related to, usually it's related to software. So it's where you might click on something and you get some instant feedback and allows you to actually adjust what you're doing because you recognize that, oh, actually I've pressed the wrong button. So you hop in the elevator, you press the button and you go, oh, I'm on level 3, I wanted level 5. And then of course there's obvious ones that we use in with our interfaces with our desktop computers and iPhones and things like that. Classic, probably the most useful functions that we ever use are the control, the copy and paste function, which has probably increased productivity across the globe by 3,000% over the years. And of course, the great old undo button. And the favorite, probably the most important one, is, are you sure you want to exit an application before you save it? Imagine how frustrating it would be if you close that screen and that didn't pop up, and how much work you could have potentially lost over the years. We also have some heuristics that are more designed to be, they kind of, when you're considering the design to match something that you as a user may already be familiar with. And so these ones might be more related to things you've learned as you've grown up. So what you really want to use it to be able to do is to identify something because it's related to something that you know in the real world. So that's the first one there. So if you see a little house icon, for example, on a screen, you think home, well, because that relates to a house, but it also relates to the home page of say, a website or a tool that you might be using. So using symbols that actually reflect our real world help us. Keeping things consistent in standard. It might be that something's not necessarily a great standard, but because it's consistent, we at least understand what it means. So if someone came out tomorrow and came up with a study and said the stop sign is actually, there's a better stop sign that we could be using, it'd be easier to see in the distance, we probably would hesitate to actually make any changes because it's so consistent with how we actually view those signs. We wouldn't go about making wholesale changes. I might just jump onto the last few so we can jump into this activity. We also have some heuristics that are kind of broader, and they're almost getting back to what I was sort of bringing up earlier around looking at the psychology where we look at patterns as a whole rather than in individual parts. So when we look for overall, when we step back and look at something, it might even be the layout of a document. We might think to ourselves, well, does that actually all sort of come together nicely? Does it actually make sense together on that one page? Can I actually distinguish between the front and the back of an image? You know, is there a background and then there's information that sits in front of it, which is the figure and ground? There's also some heuristics around kind of almost like the structure of things. So you can use repetition and rhythm in things. You can use variety, again, to make things stand out, but also to make things interesting for the user so it's less monotonous. So if you're designing like designing a task for someone working in a control room where they might be working on a monotonous task, breaking up their tasks is an example of variety. How things actually move in the environment, so how your eyes move over the physical space that you're looking at, how you want people to say look at a website and you know, move and where do the eyes actually meet? Do you want them to meet it at the most important information that you want them to remember? And then the last ones are around the importance heuristics. I mentioned one of those earlier. Essentially using using specific aspects of the design to really elevate certain criteria as important. And perhaps the most memorable example is when they use that big red button for things to demonstrate the nuclear button. You know, you sort of imagine that the president has this little flip top thing in his desk with a big red button sitting there because it's often used in cartoons. So that's an example of, I guess, highlighting importance through the size, which is proportion. So a good example of that, of a couple of these heuristics and how they might actually play out in design. This is actually not exactly the same kitchen that I showed you earlier with the beam. I think it's another apartment in that building, and they've actually used a couple of design principles at least to try and improvise to solve this problem. And perhaps what principles they're using is almost trying to create a sense of closure by having that there. So it feels like it's not just hanging out there. That seems to kind of like, it all kind of fits together nicely. Perhaps it also demonstrates a sense of continuity so that things actually all link up nicely with each other, and you don't feel like the beam's sort of just hanging out there. All right, we'll return to the board now and explore these in a little bit more detail. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen again. We're going to jump back on. If you're not already there, Sharika will pop the link in the chat again, and I'll share my screen. And I see Leah Watson, old and losing its grip. That's me. That's very good. Okay, I'll just pop over back to the landing page. All right. So just wait for my connection to jump back on again. Let's zip over now to the next activity. So I think we're actually over in the last one over here. Is that right, Sharika? You might be able to bring us over to the right spot. Yeah, this is the one here. So once again, guys, we'll jump into the next activity. And I believe the next one here, we'll be doing a bit of an assessment using some heuristics, and Patrick can actually introduce this. I'll zoom in a little bit now. Yeah, great. All right, so you'll probably see there on the actual the slide pack I showed you then, we didn't show you the detail. So in the card set that we actually developed, there's more detail on each side of the card. So you can actually zoom in to that information if you want to take a bit of a closer look. But I'll let Patrick now introduce the activity. And then,
yeah, thank you, mate. Appreciate it. So Nick, just for the benefit of those who are playing along on Zoom, you might want to, could you please just zoom right in so we can see both the controller as well as those cards. And so they're able just to review what's going on. So guys, for this particular activity, what we want you to do is consider the PlayStation 1 controller that is down there below. So Nick, if you could please show that first. You could show the controller, please.
Yep.
Here we go. That'd be great. So yes, consider that controller. Keep that in your mind. There we see very famous controller, very famous set of buttons as well, now adopted as part of their core branding. So Nick, if you go up. What we want you to do is, with a coin over the top, if you can move up to those cards, please, Nick.
Sure.
What we want you to do is to indicate, using a coin, which of these particular principles is not present on that particular controller.
And it's actually just one of those. Well, we think one, but however, some of these things can be subjective, of course. So if you disagree, you can pop it in the chat and be interesting for us to consider. But there should just be one that that probably is not as relevant as others. I might just pop it down the bottom there, guys.
I think I tend to agree where this is headed myself, but seems to be, if we take a look at that controller again briefly, yeah, sort of a trade-off between universality and specificity, where you can't have a button with an icon that tells you specifically what will happen if you press the button in a game, because they are used for a great diversity of different types of games. So what might be jumping in one game might be acceleration in another game, or something else entirely. But that means that you need to become accustomed to or reacquaint yourself with what they do every time you start a different type of game.
Yeah, I must admit the one I selected, and I'll be happy to concede to the crowd. I won't say, but it's not the one that's popping up there, interestingly, although I can see the case for it, that one.
Well, and I think to a point that I think it was Dia raised earlier, in relation to how intuitive the use of something might be, might differ according to one's experiences, and perhaps even one's own physical dimensions. Like I've got reasonably large hands, and I can tell you that the that PlayStation 1 controller seemed, at least to me, to be designed for hands that are smaller than mine, and so you could feel quite cramped in holding it after a while.
All right, we might reveal what was in my mind at the time. Interesting. I actually thought that proportion was the one that perhaps is less prominent there, and the only reason for that was that it feels like to me that everything is actually fairly much the same size. There's no real great emphasis in size there that directs you to one particular button. It doesn't tell you which of those buttons is the most important one on the right or the left. It doesn't direct you to the start or the select button or in any particular way. I don't know. What do you guys think? Pop in the chat if you disagree. Whereas the match between system and real world, I think you could probably make a case that it isn't generally, but there were elements, I think, that do match the real world. And I think the start button, for example, is that weird triangle on its side, which is it's become like a universal symbol for play. Although probably could make the case that that's a symbol still, it may not actually match what is played exactly in the real world. So, and also perhaps the use of shapes that are quite recognizable in the real world as well now, possibly can make again the case that they're still quite abstract. So I can see the case for that one, definitely. All right, we might move on to the next one. Pat, what do you reckon? Or we already done?
Yes, absolutely.
I think we've already done. Oh, yep.
So some have got started on the next one. Yep. And this, so for anyone who has kids probably of a certain age, I guess they're probably teenagers now, may be very acquainted with this one here, the old Wii controller. Hopefully you didn't put it through your TV and swinging it around. So very, very well-known controller, one of the most famous, I think, developed and certainly very popular, many, many millions of units sold, and very different to what had come immediately before it, given its use of motion tracking in order to enable a different type of interaction with the console and the games themselves. So similar principle here, which is the principle here that is missing from that particular controller design.
Yeah, and the ones that everyone selected there.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Now, on this occasion, yeah, look, I think most people are kind of moving to error prevention, and that's the one I selected anyway that I thought was the least relevant there. So I think, and the reason I selected it was I felt that the other controllers in history kind of are more structured, whereas the Wii had such a free range of movement that it wasn't really designed to be extremely precise. It was actually allowing you to be quite free and open with what you were doing. And partly because you could essentially move the controller around on many different angles, and it could be disconnected from the connection, and you may not be able to actually, you may not always move your arm in the most appropriate way, but pressing a button with your thumb is much more definitive. So, yeah, but certainly you obviously all picked up on that, all that the other ones there certainly are good examples of those design heuristics. So when you start to break, this is essentially doing like ergonomic or usability assessment in a very simple way. It's looking at structured categories and going through and trying to work out which area is actually working, which isn't working. So if you've got particular issues with the design of something, and it doesn't matter what context it is, you can actually pull out principles like this and almost work through and go, oh, I can actually see why this actually isn't working. And I found that quite a lot with the design of, say, procedures and documents and things as well. Or sometimes you'll look at a page and think it's not doesn't quite work, but if I move this and take this out and put a bit more white space in it, it seems to come together a bit more. And you can't quite put your finger on why it is. And the idea of doing this is it's paying formal recognition to something that would otherwise be kind of your gut feel, which really in many ways is how psychology works as well. Like if you're not a trained psychologist, you're still applying psychology all the time because you're a human being and you're learning and you're reacting to people. What all psychology brings to the table is usually that you're having a more deliberate focus and going through more of a methodology in order to reach those conclusions. Got a few Q&As up there, guys. If you you guys might be able to respond to those. If not, I can probably try to answer those at the end. So just so you know, guys, we haven't forgotten the Q&A. All right, so we might just, in the interest of time, we might actually jump into the final activity, Pat. So we might jump over the last bit of content and look at a real world example. So follow over to the Miro board, guys, to the link, and you know the drill now. If you're over now at the home board, which you can probably see on my screen now, then follow over to the, oh, sorry, we're over here now. Yep, and Sharika, you might be able to keep bringing people over here. That'd be great. And then we'll go to the last board, and I'll hand over to my friend Patrick to take us through this one. Just give everyone a couple of minutes.
No worries. Whilst that's loading, Nick, did you want to perhaps have a look at the Q&A? Check out the questions that you've got there.
Indeed. I'll just put myself on mute for a second. I'll type back. It'll be easier.
Alrighty, so we can see that loading up, guys. This is a similar activity to the one that we had just completed. As you can see, either on the Miro board if you're there yourself, or on the screen, we have a series of parking signs. I think anyone who's navigated inner city Melbourne will probably be familiar with the sometimes apparently chaotic combination of signs. Diabolical is probably another good word for it. Combination of signs on posts. I think I've been caught out at least once, parking in inner city Melbourne. And what we would like you to do with this particular activity, and don't feel that you need to get stuck into it just yet, but prepare yourself to do so, is to identify which principle you feel is reflected well or best, if you like, within that particular design, and then select one which you feel is least reflected in that particular design, or not particularly implemented well, or implemented least well, worst even, if you like. So you use the gold coin to indicate which one you think is done well, and a red coin to indicate the one. Can you please zoom in there, Nick, as well, please, mate, so people can see the detail of those cards for those following along on Zoom. Right, if you could just go down there, please, and show them the combination of signs. I think we won't need too long to get a sense of what's going on here. I feel, no, the other one, please. Start with the other one first. To the, yep, Okay, so yeah, the first one there. So here we go. The one on the left. The one on the left.
I think I've got a lag on my screen. You want the...
Okay, yeah. So we've seen the combination of signs. Just yes, this big old nasty stack of sign with the acronym CCUSD permits, which I thought as soon as I saw it must be short for or an abbreviated or contracted form of a cursed permits here. Or cursed permits. If you could please go up and show the principles, please, Nick, that'd be helpful. And we'll have a look at where people said, oh, okay, here we go. So contrast and emphasis. Some are saying this is done well, others saying not so great. Proportion, hierarchy, error prevention, consistency and standards, and enclosure. So Nick, I might get you to do the debrief on those, please, before then moving across to show the right example and then the principles.
Yeah, I think, yeah, definitely. This is like a good visualization assessment. I agree with everything that's been popped up here. Certainly prevention, I can imagine myself getting mixed up. I get mixed up with just one sign, let alone all of those. And the one that popped out to me was closure, because I think that even after you parked there and read the sign, you'd still have this awful feeling that you still have missed one of those little sub rules. So yeah, certainly all of those are quite accurate, I think. If we scroll over to the right and look at the responses there, yeah, look, it looks interestingly, most people kind of liked that design. It's an interesting one. I can imagine some people also getting confused with it because it's unfamiliar. Not everyone necessarily looks at images like that. They might feel more comfortable having the certainty of the rule itself. Although, and in the past, when we've worked in organisations and we've visualised, say, procedures and rules, sometimes we'll have stakeholders who say people want to read stuff. They like to. Not everyone likes to look at visuals. And my sort of response is always then, I bet you they've got a smartphone in their pocket and they're using a visual interface all the time. I think it's actually universal that people prefer visuals. It isn't preference. I don't think there's a large preference for just reading text. And I think this sort of actually flows out that way. But yeah, certainly I'm thinking and looking at the ones that most of you kind of said all of those things were quite good. I do think that it probably does prevent error, with the exception of maybe that red one there could represent people who are unfamiliar with it. They might make a mistake. But a good example of error prevention there is if you go to the any time after 4 o'clock on those days, you know sure that you will not get a ticket. I think that's what's wonderful about that design, is that you can have a lot of certainty and a lot of closure on that. Certainly all of Sunday, you know, you're completely in the clear. That image, what it tells you immediately is the one day I've got to be really careful is the days I've got to be careful are during the week. And it's basically telling me I can't really park there at all except after hours. That's really what it says. It's a nice clean message. Now, look, just in the interest of time, and this is, I guess, an accelerated version of this module, and it really technically only got scheduled 2 minutes left. We'll continue going through the material, but feel free to stay on if you'd like to. Feel free to drop off. There will be a recording here. I'm hoping that the webinar doesn't just sort of cut us off at in 2 minutes, but if it does, thanks for attending today. I don't think it will. But what we'll do is we'll now return to the presentation, and I'll just stop sharing my screen again. And I'll share the PowerPoint again. Okay, so I'm imagining that everyone can see this now. I will just skip over to the last section here. So yeah, look, I have that example that we had on the screen before, and yeah, certainly some of the ones that I thought were done quite well over there. I actually had over on the left, I thought the one on the left is probably a bad example of hierarchy, but it probably is an example of using hierarchy to try and emphasize information. Whether it's done right or wrong, that's kind of almost the way they've tried to structure it. And I think probably one of the positives of the one on the left is that it is consistent with something that we're familiar with. That's the only, or the strongest benefit of it. is that you go to it and you know, look, I've seen signs like this before where it basically gives me rules. Whereas the one on the right, probably the biggest drawback is that it is inconsistent with standard. And that, interestingly, is the other thing that holds back a lot of design, especially in infrastructure, where new ideas and new innovations are actually suppressed because they are inconsistent with standard, but not necessarily a lesser idea. Here's a few more examples before we wrap up, just to explore the context in a little bit more detail. So London Underground, the original map, versus the one you have today. Both of them look fairly complex and confusing. Perhaps the difference we have there is that the one on the right perhaps is trying to organise things with a bit more symmetry as best that it can, whereas the one on the left was trying to almost map the real distance between stations or visualise it in a way that was more related to the real world. So that's kind of maybe the biggest difference. Obviously, the one on the right is probably more complex now because there's more links and more stations and things. Let's take a controller. You're probably all familiar with the type of controller on the left that gave us all headaches many years ago. They still seem to make them this way, unfortunately, sometimes. Now the Magic Remote from LG. We've got you know, potentially the one on the left, well, both the left and the right actually do make use of the hierarchy. They've got probably the most important button at the top, which is the power button. If all else fails, turn everything on and off. So that does actually utilize hierarchy. The one on the left has far too much variety. There's so much going on there that I think it would confuse people. Whereas the one on the right is perhaps more minimalist in its design. Having a look at a wonderful web interface. So if we look on the one on the left, we don't see these sorts of websites as much anymore, but you probably, those of you who are old enough to remember the first websites, these were fairly familiar, they're fairly common. Again, the one on the left does utilize a certain level of hierarchy. It's got headings and subheadings. There's certainly some contrast and emphasis there, but the wonderful thing about the Google search function, which is great innovation in itself, is its minimalist look, which they haven't lost over the years. There's certainly a sense of closure. There aren't 50,000 options to pick from, and it's got that sort of nice contrast between the figure and ground. So you've got basically the background white, and then the only information you need just sticks right out. This is a wonderful elevator. This is like the elevator from hell. That's the elevator that takes you to that image that I showed you earlier in the presentation, where you can't recognize anything. And the one on the right is also quite an interesting one. I actually think perhaps the one on the right is perhaps over-designed, over-engineered for a very simple function. It's tried to use lots of variety to help the user remember what level they're on. So it's used numbers, it's used colors, and it's used symbols. I think you run the risk of perhaps creating confusion where someone hops into the elevator and goes, I remember I was on the floor with an animal, but now I've just realized that there's 3 animals to choose from. And so you're actually introducing a possible error by throwing in that. But the one on the left is definitely using contrast and emphasis, using color and variety as well. But the way it's organized is they haven't actually organized it in a symmetrical way or a way that's kind of easy for your eye to follow. So you're kind of doing this, and it seems to have a series of redundant buttons on the right, which is confusing. I'm not sure why they would have designed it that way, but that's a really good example of where something breaks the pattern of what you would normally like to see, and immediately it just feels wrong. We get back to sort of more physical stuff. The door handles on the left are notorious for people who have difficulty opening doors. It could be for injury or disability. So you look at the handle where you've got to hold the grip with your hand and not actually use the leverage of your arm. Then you're really relying. It's very difficult for someone who's, say, got arthritis to turn something like that. The other one, that sliding door, is a great hazard for trapping your hand. The ones on the right tend to be a bit easier to hold because they've got that little curve in them, which allows you to actually to grip a bit better. So perhaps that falls under the texture category. We've got nuclear control panels. again, I'm sure if you worked in a nuclear power plant, then you probably get so familiar with that one on the left that it would look perfect to you and make perfect sense to you. But I think to the average user, you'd look at that initially and think, what a sea of chaos. The one on the right, obviously it's only a small fraction, and they say training use only, but it's certainly laid out in such a way that is a little bit more intuitive. I think I've used this presentation in the past, and there is some errors in the one on the right as well, because they've got the open and close button. The close has got a green light with it, and maybe close is probably a good thing in some contexts, probably context dependent, but it might be counterintuitive in that close might often be associated with red, and that you're preventing the door from opening. So actually made pretty good time, given that we only had 90 minutes to zip through the activities. So what I will do is wrap up, so I don't, for those of you who do want to stay right to the end, you don't sort of missing out on your next meeting. But just in general, what we're really trying to do with looking at these design principles is that we're looking at universal features that people ultimately can understand. And so we actually understand that as humans, we're all very different, but there is a unique common psychology amongst us that can be capitalized on in design. And if we design things effectively, understanding that, then most of the elements in our environment can be intuitively operated. And where they can't, there certainly are options to customize those things so that different users can actually still access. And there's, I guess, more inclusivity in that design. I'll return back to the program that we have designed. So that's just really a real crash course in the second module that we're running. The one we will run for real online will be with smaller groups and allow for a little bit more interactivity and a little bit some new content in there as well once it's all finalized. We've also got all these other modules as well, which you can access the link to that at any time. There's the QR code if you're interested to log on at any time and take a look at what that program looks like. Feel free also to email us if you've got any queries. You've probably been sent an invitation from Sharika. You could reply to that, or you could email myself or Patrick. So nick@opposite.com.au or patrick@opposite.com.au, or just hop on our website. You'll see a link there as well to our email address. Look, the program is designed over that sort of 8-week micro module each Friday morning. So hopefully to kind of fit in with people's schedules. And you also get a set of our opposite cards that cover many other topics. This is only one of them. So there's a card set for every topic. Sorry. Yep. Oh,
yeah, Nick, I was just before we finish up, mate, I was just going to mention there's a couple of questions that I do not think that we've responded to yet, which are relevant at this point. One is, will we share this slide deck? And two, where will the recording of this be located for later access?
Yeah, very good questions. To answer the first one is, we won't share the slide deck because it's part of the training content, obviously. Ironically, we will be sharing the webinar, which has the slide deck in it. I will circulate that via email initially, because I'm not too sure where we're going to actually launch that yet, but we've recorded it. We'll circulate it via email to you for those who've registered, or at least send you the link to it. So we might actually just pop it on YouTube or something and then just send the link around. That's what we did in the last webinar that we did. So that's most likely what will happen. So give us 48 hours and we'll have those things to you. And in the meantime, yeah, feel free to, of course, reach out if there's any other queries. Or if you've got any other questions. I could probably stay on the chat for another couple of minutes if you have any more questions, any specific questions. Thanks for all the chat comments there, guys. That's really great. Really pleased to have got through without any technical difficulties, which is nothing short of a miracle when you're dealing with lots of interactive boards and people dialing in from all over the place.